Black Panther. I'm sorry, that's Kente. I'm sorry, Nancy Pelosi, Wakanda forever. This is the absurdity of the COVID-19 lockdowns, liberal mandates, and of course, even a little cultural appropriations. This is very ridiculous. It's the closest thing you'll ever see to fascism in the history of this country. They told us to stay in our homes. They told us not to go to church. They told us not to attend funerals and only leave our homes for what they deemed to be essential travel. And when we rightly questioned the efficacy of their decrees, they told us to trust the science. Well, I'm about to show you what real fascism looks like, and I'm about to show you what their science really looks like. During the pandemic, something struck me. People weren't allowed to use jogging or biking trails, even in my hometown of Houston, Texas. And speaking of Houston, our Democrat mayor ordered around 500 basketball nets removed from public courts because, God forbid, anyone have any fun outside to get essential vitamins and fresh air. Skate parks were filled with sand in California, so people couldn't play outside and, again, get fresh air. In Malibu, paddleboarders were arrested for the crime of paddleboarding alone in the middle of the ocean. However, one group of people were exempt from lockdowns, from mandates, and apparently from the virus itself. Now, I'm of the opinion that this group of people should have their blood tested because who knows? Maybe they had the cure before we had the vaccine. And I think you know what group I'm talking about. That's right, I am talking about the righteous George Floyd protesters. According to one political article, these protesters risked their health and their life for, quote, the health of our nation. And do you remember those same health professionals telling us to stay home or else you're gonna kill grandma? 1,000 of those same health professionals signed a letter saying, don't shut down protests using coronavirus concerns as an excuse. Interesting, as an excuse. People lost their jobs and their livelihood in this country because they chose not to take the vaccine. People weren't allowed into restaurants because they didn't show their vaccine papers, their vaccine card. Our schools were shut down and our children were sent home. The result? Youth suicide rates increased dramatically, and children lost years of education that they'll never get back. Dr. Ladapo, thank you for being here, sir. Yes or no, in your professional medical experience and Harvard education, as the Surgeon General of Florida, are Democrats and liberals immune to COVID-19?
No, sir, to the best of my knowledge.
A follow-up question to that. You set Florida's response to COVID-19, and how would you explain bodies not piling up in Los Angeles after the George Floyd protests?
For one, there was very, very, very little transmission outdoors. That was a major part. Most of the protesters, from what I saw, were young people that probably also contributed, but there was almost no transmission outdoors. And it broke my heart when they pulled the basketball hoops in the playgrounds that I was taking my kids to in Los Angeles. I mean, I could have, I'll stop it there, but broke my heart.
Thank you for your response. Much like the vast majority of liberal policies, this rule's for thee and not for me, and apparently that also applies to COVID lockdowns and mandates. It was okay to make exceptions for when the left believes was a righteous cause. The left said it was safe for 100,000 people to protest, 100,000 people in the middle of a pandemic, but they were giving you grief for letting people sit on the beach or paddleboard in the middle of the ocean. Why? Because in the case of the George Floyd protest, it was a righteous cause in their opinion. And by the way, it wasn't just protest, it was rioting, it was looting, it was attacking and burning a police station in Minneapolis, it was rioting in front of the White House to such an extent that President Trump had to be ushered into a bunker. And all this was acceptable because it was deemed righteous by the left. Speaking of righteous causes, let's take a look at Black Panther. I'm sorry, that's Kente. I'm sorry, Nancy Pelosi, Wakanda forever. This is the absurdity of the COVID-19 lockdowns, liberal mandates, and of course, even a little cultural appropriations. This is very ridiculous. We must never allow something like this to ever happen again in this country. It's why we have a constitution in the first place, to protect us from the exact type of government overreach that we saw during the pandemic. No matter what side of the political aisle that you find yourself, You should always be on the side of freedom and preserving our rights via the Constitution. And that's why many of us walked away from the pandemic and the protests that followed, asking the question, were the COVID restrictions really about public safety, or were they about winning an election? You decide.